Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Plaza's Film Talkback program. I am Norma Levy, president of New Plaza. We're a nonprofit showing independent and foreign films and providing educational programs on classic cinema. Today, our curator, Gary Palmucci, has chosen a compelling 1953 film called The Bigamist. It stars Ida Lupino, and she directed it as well. She's a perfect choice for Women's History Month, as she was the only woman director in Hollywood in the 1940s and the 1950s. Today, Gary will be joined in his talkback by Laurie Turchin. Laurie is a film industry veteran and educator and a film festival programmer. I hope you enjoy the talkback, and now I'm going to turn this over to Gary.
Well, thanks, Norma, and hello again, everyone. In honor of Women's History Month, we chose Ida Lupino's The Bigamist for this week's film. Now, I was first introduced about 20 years or so ago by my significant other to the half dozen low-budget but very high-quality films that Ida produced and directed in the late 40s and early 50s. She was a pioneer independent filmmaker, and these films, most of which are easy to see online, hold up pretty well today. They've certainly stayed in my mind. Max Alvarez is away this week, but joining me in a discussion of The Bigamist today is Laurie Turchin. Laurie, whom I met this week, is a 20-year veteran of the motion picture industry in the fields of production of high-end commercials, both of film and TV. She's worked in just about every aspect of production and post-production, which you'll see serves her well for some observations on the low-budget aspects of The Bigamist. And she's a film festival manager in the state of Florida, as well as a professor of motion picture arts. So, Laurie, welcome to New Plaza's Talkback. Thanks for joining us.
I love that the audience becomes the presenter now. I've been with you guys all year since COVID. It's been a pleasure.
That's great. Well, as we usually do here, we're going to start by running the original trailer of The Bigamist, and you may have to bear with me a few moments while we rewind a portion of it, but let's put it on screen and see what we have.
What price should a woman pay for one night of indiscretion?
Are you sure you want me?
I'm sure.
Your love on hurt.
The Bigamist. One careless moment, one false step, and 3 people were trapped.
How long has this double life of yours been going on?
Filmmakers, producers of Hollywood's most daring motion pictures, proudly presents Joan Fontaine, Ida Lupino, Edmund O'Brien, and Edmund Gwen in the shocking story of 2 women who gave all their love to one man. See The Bigamist.
Well, Laurie, I think you and I did see that trailer earlier in the week, and I'd encourage our viewers to check it out either at some point this afternoon or afterward. It runs about 45 seconds, but like the film in general, it kind of walks a tightrope between serious drama and a little bit of a melodramatic presentation of the story. But before we get further into that, you are, I know from our discussions earlier this week, you know a lot about the history of women filmmakers in the first half of the 20th century in Hollywood.
Yes, absolutely. Ida at this point in time was one of the few, perhaps only women directors around, but she was very much compared to Lois Weber from the silent era. If you've never seen it, there's a great documentary called Be Natural, which all over her set were signs Be Natural. And both women they were women making movies about women, and they didn't shy away from tough issues. You don't get any tougher than naming your movie The Bigamist, or her first directorial debut, Not Wanted, about abortion. She really got down there, and she didn't make Alice Guy Blaché was a contemporary of Lois Weber's, who made sort of ephemeral we would call them women's movies, and Lois and Ida really sort of championed more social issues and more social conscience.
Some of our New Plaza viewers may remember we ran that documentary Be Yourself at our late lamented NYIT Cinema.
Yeah, this is Be Natural. It's great. Jodie Foster narrates it. And, both women, Lois and Ida, I'd like to hear your thoughts, Gary. They really do sort of genre, gender bending a lot. And I was wondering what you thought of that.
Well, I don't, it's been a long time since I've seen any of Lois Weber's films. We released several of them at a company I worked at many years ago, but I think you probably have seen them more recently than me to give those details.
Yeah, I watched one recently, Shoes, but
Shoes was one we released.
yeah, very similar. I also, just on this odd note, I started watching Handmaid's Tale, and it's very interesting because as I was watching it, and then I started watching the movie, The Bigamist, I saw a lot of parallels, and I want to say almost homages to The Bigamist in The Handmaid's Tale. You have women who are not fertile and women who are fertile, and I just saw a lot of parallels, and I just really, in my own head, wondered what the influence was, if there was.
And Alice Guy Blaché, as I said, she was another pioneer featured in that documentary. She actually was not born. Was she born in the U.S. or not? Refresh my memory.
She was French. They both oddly started with Gaumont Pictures, Leon Gaumont. Lois worked for his company here in America, and Alice eventually came to America. But again, actually Alice was the first to dapple with early sound on film and having synchronous sound and making sort of like music videos. So each had their different style, but the contribution was still a great help.
Another very important name at this time was Dorothy Arsner, who made a number of comedies and dramas for Warner Brothers. The most famous one, which I happened to revisit recently, called Dance Girl Dance, which I recommend to everyone interested in this topic. Maureen O'Hara, Lucille Ball, very, very hard-hitting film, very, very contemporary in its view of female exploitation.
Well, it's interesting because there's two stories about when, sound came about, who invented the boom mic. I don't know if any of you know, but when early sound came about, there was a lot of issues, and eventually they literally took a story that Dorothy Arsner was the one who created that. She also wore pants on set, which was really kind of forward thinking for the time. But there's another story that says a studio guy, Eddie Mannix, did it. So, people think history can be black and white, and it really depends who you talk to.
Well, I think a lot of us probably know Ida Lupino from some of her terrific film performances in the 40s in films like High Sierra, They Drive by Night, Nicholas Ray's On Dangerous Ground, The Man I Love. A friend of mine, Glenn Erickson, who writes a column called Cine Savant, wrote something about Dorothy Arsner when he released The Bigamist a few years ago. And I'd like to read just a little snippet from it. He says, "Let's get one thing clear up front. Ida Lupino was never a neglected talent, nor one who was barred by the Hollywood Boys Club. It is true that the studio system once actively suppressed women filmmakers at many levels. Another documentary called Without Lying Down makes it clear that when the talkies came, male bosses found ways to get rid of women writers, directors, and editors, and gave those jobs to quote unquote qualified men. The industry knew her well and knew how tough she was, and when she wanted to direct, she found little resistance. As a genuine star in the 1940s, Lupino was a showbiz pro who knew the ropes and had studied the methods of her directors, in particular Raoul Walsh. As the 40s wore on and front rank roles stopped coming her way, she took the opportunity to get into production, producing, writing, and directing. Her second husband and creative partner, Collier Young, had contacts at numerous studios, and although their production company never achieved a real breakout hit, every effort, as I was saying before, was a quality picture. The name of their company, The Filmmakers, they were pioneering independents, but they were never like outsiders like Roger Corman or Stanley Kubrick."
Yeah, originally RKO, I believe they had cut like there was a 5-picture deal on the table, and RKO pulled out, and then the people who eventually decided to make The Bigamist, I don't think, like each film was like $125,000 budget, which, is pretty cheap even for then. And this was the one that got made. And it really is, it's noir without being noir, if that makes any sense. It's sort of noir light. What do you think?
Noir of the emotions, I think, is is what I'd call it.
Well, no one in the movie, like in noir, to me, noir, the image that you see in noir is very black and white, and this movie is a much more shades of gray. And no one's really bad. Like, I'm not like booing anyone in particular. And I really think, from a gender and a genre, it bends a lot of the conventions. I mean, Edmund O'Brien's this 1950s man with all the conventions. Don't think it was lost on me that they're in the deep freeze business, and their marriage is sort of in a deep freeze. And he really, what he does, it's a noir in that what he does, the act of bigamy, is illegal, but there's not that violence and shoot 'em up kind of feel that a noir has. I felt it was a lot more relatable as a noir, because he isn't really a bad guy. He's not like a player.
He's kind of a typical Hollywood character of that moment in time, the early 50s, the emotionally and economically beset American male of the post-World War II era. It's a society that was very much in flux after the war.
And it was interesting because the other day we were talking and someone said something about their beds were separate. And I watched it again this morning, and it actually, the first time you see their bedroom, he's napping. And it's not really clear if it's two separate beds or not. I got the impression it wasn't. And then the next time you see the bedroom, there's a big table in between the two beds. And then the third time you see the bedroom, the beds are back, because there's some really nice touching moments between them. It's not, it's only her barrenness and the fact that they have agreed to give her a bigger, he says that, when they have people over for dinner, he asks him to go get the sherry. That's usually what a woman does. And
you were drawing on some of your production experience when we spoke early in the week, and explaining to me how the way that Joan Fontaine, as his wife, and Ida Lupino are lit is very contrasting and emotionally telling as well.
Yeah, and in their home, there's like this one Asian statue and an Asian style chair. And it's like they're both women, but they represent sort of these stereotypes. And Joan Fontaine, she plays a very typical Joan Fontaine role. I mean, I don't know if anyone knows, she's sister to Olivia de Havilland, and was known for playing they were both English originally and played very proper kind of roles. And here she is most of the time, her hair is up, blonde, sort of that Hitchcock blonde, if you will. What do you think, Gary?
Well, you were talking about the lighting, and you said that the lighting of Joan Fontaine is kind of flat and harsh by comparison to Ida.
Yeah, well, Joan Fontaine's take on it is that once they finished shooting Joan and the lighting was flat, that when director / actress Lupino went in for her footage, that she changed lighting styles. But there are those that would argue that as the film director, that the choice she made was a little more thematic and a little less vain than Fontaine. But they had here's the fun thing. I don't know if you all know a lot or whatever, but this movie really is an inside joke in a lot of ways. Am I wrong, Gary?
Well, you seem to be quite well versed in the art versus real life aspects of the film, which I'm sure you could elaborate on.
Yeah. First of all, there's Ed Gwynn, okay, who most of us, if we like cinema, recommend as the Santa from 34th Street. And
One of 4 Oscar winners in this movie for a Best Actor or Acting Performance. Certainly a record for a low-budget film of this kind, I would think.
exactly. And they actually, the first time we meet him, they actually were like, I think it's Edmund O'Brien who says, oh, he's like a little Santa Claus, you know. And then, of course, the first time we meet Ida Lupino and they're on the bus tour, they point out like all these houses, one of them at Gwen's house, where, you know, and most of the people's houses they pick out or point out are friends of Ida. But I thought it was really interesting when I watched it today that she's on a tour bus, but she's sleeping. What do you
Yes.
think?
That scene, as we were discussing, to me is kind of like, in some ways, you know, every movie has, to me, has a scene that's kind of the heart and soul of the film. And maybe you have one as well, Laurie, but that kind of, you know, courtship essentially between Edmund
Right.
O'Brien and that very deliberate way in which she gradually starts to pay attention to him, and that he opens his heart kind of very awkwardly and nakedly at first, and then obviously their story proceeds from there.
Well, you know, I also thought it was very interesting that at some point, Edmund O'Brien actually turns around to Joan Fontaine's character, Eve, and tells her about Phil, you know. He calls her a funny little mouse, you know. And there's even another point where Joan Fontaine herself brings it up. And I was like, wow, you know, like they've actually talked about it and made a joke of it.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the real life parallels of what was going on with Ida Lupino's husband Collier Young and some of the cast.
Can we talk? So Collier Young and Ida Lupino were husband and wife. They created a production company, The Filmmaker. When they made this movie, The Bigamist, Collier Young was the screenwriter and the producer. And of course, because RKO backed out, their company
This is RKO being at that time run by the infamous Howard Hughes, totally mercurial and I think destructive in a lot of ways to the
totally
picture.
ran the studio into the ground. He's more concerned about creating a bra for Rosalind Russell, or I'm sorry, Jane Russell.
It took most of the 1940s.
But when they got out of that deal, you know, Ida just really their company. Okay, so Collier and Ida are married, and then she has an extramarital affair with Howard Duff and gets pregnant. And they end up getting a divorce, and then Collier Young marries Joan Fontaine. Okay, are y'all following this? It's very, very sordid.
All before the film was finished.
Right, exactly. So literally, Ida and Joan in real life had shared the same man at some point. And Ida had literally in real life gotten pregnant through an extramarital affair, you know, aka unmarried. And I thought it was really interesting that the judge toward the end says something like, had you kept her as just a mistress, we wouldn't have been as harsh about it. But because you've married her and made it illegal.
Well, to that point, you know, you and I were digging through the archives looking for some of the, you know, writing on the film over the years, and I came across something in the Village Voice by the very important and very prescient film critic Molly Haskell, who fortunately is
Love
still with
Molly.
us. She was married to Andrew Saris, of course, for a long time. He has passed away, but in 1972 in New York City, there was what they called the first Women's International Film Festival at a theater long gone, the Fifth Avenue Cinema downtown. And its curators, according to Molly, exhaustively looked through the films made by women, you know, all through the 20th century. And The Bigamist made the cut among several hundred that were considered. And here's a funny, and again, I think very prescient piece by Molly Haskell from this article about The Bigamist. She writes, the idea of Edmund O'Brien with a sex appeal rating of -7, married simultaneously to Ida Lupino and Joan Fontaine, may strike you as comical. Well, it is. But at the same time, you come to realize it's just this kind of kind-hearted, simple-minded clod who would marry a second woman rather than keep her as a mistress. It's not the roue, but the family man who is a candidate for bigamy. and, pardon me, that half of him is all that any woman would want. In what at first appears to be the great reverse casting of all time, Joan Fontaine plays the wife who, unable to have a child, excuse me, becomes a partner in his business and doubles the profits, while Ida Lupino is the mousy waitress in LA that he meets on a business trip, grows fond of, and impregnates. In one of those unstated but obvious conclusions, the film suggests that bigamy is the ideal arrangement for this threesome, although they will have to submit to the laws of America and the production code. At a comically perfunctory trial, the judge says reprovingly that O'Brien will have to go back to one wife or the other, if either will have him. As spectators file out of the courtroom, we have a close-up of Ida Lupino giving him a look that says, quote, "You're forgiven, go back to her. After all, I've got my child and a name for him." Joan Fontaine lingers, obviously the winner or loser, depending on how you look at it. She seems willing to take him back. After all, it's his company that she's running. This is definitely a film whose intuitions outrun the conventions for expressing them or the means for resolving them.
Yeah, Eve really becomes the businesswoman, and to even the point where, the woman's supposed to take care of having a baby, and she says to Edmund O'Brien, "Can you call Mr. Arnold and arrange for it?" So in essence, it's like he's having the baby. He has to go arrange for it. So, and that's very different thinking for that point in time, don't you think?
Yes. And there is that one of our listeners reminded me on the chats about what I think is maybe the second kind of heart and soul scene in the movie, of where Joan Fontaine and when they first get to the point of decisively deciding on the adoption, she has that little mechanical toy soldier that she has bought and so forth, and that kind of is some kind of heart-wrenching surrogate for the tragedy that's about to unfold.
It's their baby, it's sort of just a cold imitation, or not replacement, you know what I'm saying, until it's like a placeholder till they get an actual baby.
And Edmund Gwenn, as the very dogged investigator for the adoption agency, has a very striking remark at the end when Edmund O'Brien has been completely exposed and laid bare, and he says to Edmund O'Brien's character, I don't know whether to condemn you or shake hands with you, or words to that effect. Shake your hand I'm not sure whether that means
it says,
shake your hand, good luck, or shake your hands, congratulations.
It says, "I can't figure out my feelings towards you. I despise you and I pity you. I don't even want to shake your hand, and yet I almost wish you luck." So
There
I
you go.
think,
Thanks for clarifying.
Ed Gwynn becomes, the Hitchcock influence here is that Ed Gwynn becomes that Hitchcock character. In Shadow of a Doubt, it's Patricia Hitchcock that kind of speaks the audience mind. It's Thelma Ritter in Rear Window that just kind of, it's like he's becomes the audience's sort of narrator and thought process, I think.
Well, you know a lot about something that's come up frequently on this program, the whole issue of censorship and the production code in films of the 30s and 40s that we've screened here. But just refresh us again briefly about the climate at that time. Obviously, The Bigamist, a major studio wouldn't have touched a subject matter like this, but certain things were gotten away with in independent films.
Well, here's the thing. The ending is rather ambiguous, but the important thing is that Edmund O'Brien doesn't get away with it. That is ultimately, he's not, they can't, the Hays Code, basically, if someone does something wrong, you can kind of show it as much as you can show it at that time, but they have to pay the price at the end. And certainly, although, very much influenced by what's about to come, the French New Wave and independent cinema. I don't know if our audience knows about the consent decree. We'll talk about that another time, but it really opened up cinema to foreign cinema, and the easing up of the Hays Code, which still really stayed in place till 1968. But, that's the whole thing with this, like, you never really see them in a bed together in a romantic way. There's one foot on the floor if they're in the same bed together. That it's a very strict code. You can Google it. So,
right around this time, and this was the last film of that series of a half dozen that Ida Lupino and her husband Collier Young produced and directed. They attempted to self-distribute The Bigamist after their misadventures with Hughes at RKO, and for some reason they chose to release the film on Christmas Day, 1953. That's one of the more bizarre examples of counter programming. It was not successful, and it kind of led to the end of their company. And uh, despite the intelligence and the craft of these films on very tight budgets, another thing that Ida Lupino was not great at was film preservation. These movies,
I don't
some of
think
them
anyone
were
was.
hard to see for a long time. And I want to just say a couple of names here in this broadcast of people I know who were involved in saving, were in a couple of cases the only film prints of The Bigamist and The Hitchhiker and Not Wanted, an earlier film of theirs. A gentleman named Greg Ford and his late partner, Ronnie Scheib, who actually were the first ones to facilitate their release on VHS video in the mid 1990s. And now they've been upgraded by other distributors as well. You know, even Alfred Hitchcock in those films that he owned himself, like Rear Window and Vertigo, I know did not do a particularly good job of preserving the elements. Fortunately, through lots of expensive restoration, they were brought back and they look terrific today. Ida was not so fortunate, but at least they're out there for our benefit
I think it was
this form.
something you sent me, Gary, that there's a new box set that's been like whatever, 4 of the movies. I think it's The Hitchhiker.
That's right. That's right. The
What were the other 2?
The distributor Kino Lorber, who actually was the company that put them out with the help of those 2 individuals on VHS about 20 years or so ago, has upgraded them, and they've gotten a lot of credit for that, deservedly.
It's funny. I just got a 4K TV and I refuse to watch it in 4K. I just can't. It just won't look the same.
Those of you here today who might have looked at The Bigamist on YouTube probably saw that the copy was not very impressive. If you want to go back and see it again on Amazon Prime, if you have a membership for free, you'll see something that looks considerably sharper and better preserved all around.
If I might, there's a great resource. I'm pretty sure it's with all public libraries. And if you have a library card, you can have access to something called Canopy with a K. Are you familiar with that?
Well, Canopy was available in New York City at one time through the New York Public Library. They, however, got into a financial disagreement about the split of revenues and fees on the programs, and the New York Public Library pulled out. But where you are down in Florida and many parts of the country, I understand it may well be and still is available. It's a great resource.
Yeah, I think I can get like 5 or 6. I mean, I get it because of I'm in education, so I have access to it. Our school has, access to different things. But it's, if anyone, I don't even know. I don't know if you can just buy a subscription. I have no idea, but it's a great resource for a lot of rare stuff. So
I think you have to have a library card. If you have a library card, say in Jersey City, and you want to get on Canopy, you should be able to do that. That's my understanding. Ironically, I remember watching, when it was available, Ingmar Bergman's early film Monica, which was released kind of as an exploitation film the very same year as The Bigamist. So they kind of share that pioneering independent influence on adult material being available to Americans, for the first time in a long time.
Well, I think we have to realize that if Ida was able to do what she did, she goes on the shoulders of the likes of the Mary Pickfords and the Dorothy Arsners. I don't know if everyone realizes, but women had a very big hand at the beginning of cinema. We were editors because they thought editing was something that women would be good at, because it's kind of like sewing, and that she, at this particular point in time, was able to do what she did. And it's like she's hard boiled in the movie, which is kind of how she is, but she's also kind of soft. It's like she's a good Joe, or Jane.
And in that historical point you were making, I think you mentioned earlier in the week that someone like John Ford had worked for, as a stunt person, one of the early women pioneer directors.
Lois
right?
Weber was the highest paid director at Universal Studios, and her first assistant director was John Ford. And I don't know if you all are familiar, but he is what I think stereotypically would call a man's man. Like, there's an interview with him and Peter Bogdanovich, and he has an eye patch,
We've shown My Darling Clementine on this program, and we hope to come back to more John Ford as time goes on. Max Alvarez is also a fan. He's a very gnarly, contradictory character, seemingly a terrible guy in some ways, and yet a genius in others. It's a conundrum.
Yeah, but Bogdanovich tries to get him to agree that he's art, there's like thought behind his shots, and like he's like, I'm a filmmaker. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. That's a standard response. But we on this program we know better. Well, Laurie, I know from our questionnaires the other day, we had a lot of diverse responses to this film, and particularly to Edmund O'Brien's character. And I think I want to thank you. And I think this might be a good time for us to get to some of those raised hands that I see
Sure.
flying around here on the screen, and
Okay.
and see what people think, and talk back, as we say.
Oh, that's why it's called Talkback. No.
One of the reasons.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Gary. So I just want to remind everybody that if you want to raise your hand, please go ahead and push the button that says reaction, and then there's a hand right next to that reaction. So just go ahead and raise it. We have a couple of hands raised right now, and if you just give me, I have one technical thing to take care of. And okay, so Daniel, would you please unmute yourself and start your video?
Yes, here I am. And nice to see you, especially Laurie. I love the backdrop.
Oh, I'm very method lecturer, it's sort of.
Well, all it needs is a guy in a trench coat and a fedora, and we'd all feel very comfortable there. I wanted to make a comment about the overall audience view of the film and what we think of Harry, that being Edmund O'Brien. And there is one scene in the film that really helps us see what kind of guy Harry is. And this is the scene that features, and I've got to look at my notes, Jerry Hausner playing Roy Esterly, who is pardon the analogy, he's the Andrew Cuomo of Harry's LA office, who just can't stay away from the blonde secretary.
Is that the guy with the drinks?
Yeah.
Drinking on the job very enthusiastically.
Yes.
Which of course no one does it anymore.
Well, no, never. But it's interesting how that character is vital to showing us who Harry is not, that he's not a predator. He's just kind of an ordinary Joe who stumbles into this situation. And that's really pivotal. And I want to take my hat off to Jerry Hausner, forgotten actor, but he's a familiar face, and we've seen him in a lot of other things. And
you have enlightened us on many of these character actors, Daniel, and we thank you.
Yeah. So that's it. I just wanted to cite that, and thank you all for recognizing Ms. Lupino, all of whose films I have seen, and I'm looking forward very much to Max's lecture when he does it later this month.
As an actor, she was kind of known as the Queen of the Bees. She was known for screaming a lot,
I recall in Raoul Walsh's They Drive by Night, and you may recall this, Daniel, as well. I believe there's one scene where she actually throws a scissors at one of the main characters in the film, which is an unforgettable image to me.
Yeah.
Well, Joan Fontaine said she would only do it if Ida acted in it. And Ida swore she would never do that. So it's the only film that she's ever both directed and acted in. But that's at the point that Joan's married to her ex, who she's got pregnant when she had an extramarital affair with the actor.
Yeah, it's like real life.
Thank you, Daniel. And our next hand is raised by Marjorie. So Marjorie, if you can please start your video and unmute yourself. Marjorie, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Oh, hi. Oh, yeah. I just wanted to bring out the point at the beginning where Laurie mentioned their separate bedrooms, and with the code at that time, that would have been for everybody. So I don't think that was really indicating a bad marriage, although it wasn't an ideal marriage. I think that's what any movie would do. at that time. They might have separated them more just to emphasize it, but the separate beds were really just part of that era.
Well, the point being though that it starts off that you really don't see if they're in separate or or the same bed. The next shot in the bedroom, they're definitely in separate beds, and then the next shot, they're not in separate beds, all in the same bedroom. So
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I
so
also,
I think it's indicative.
I view Harry as just this very good Joe who just gave into a weakness. That's all. Definitely not a bad guy on the prowl. Just weak and unfortunately a wife who did love him, I think, but just took him for granted, and she just got into her business and forgot about being a wife. But definitely, once again, not a bad person.
None of them are bad,
yeah.
None of them are bad at all, and that's that's sort of again that new wave influence at the end, where you really don't know what's going to happen at the end. I mean, they kind of lead you to believe that it's Joan that's going to stick around, but
yeah, by her appearance at the end of the courtroom, right? But it's like he was punished, but you feel bad for everybody involved because they were all victims.
Absolutely.
It evokes Jean Renoir's very famous comment about, the tragedy is that everyone has their reasons.
Yeah, that's very good. Very well put.
Yeah, you see that here for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Marjorie.
Thanks, Marjorie. Appreciate it. So I just want to remind everybody to raise your hand. Please go ahead and hit the reactions button. And next to the reactions button, there's a hand that you can raise, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions. Right now, we have 2 hands raised, and we're going to ask Abby. Abby, would you please unmute and start your video?
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for choosing this film. It was great, great fun. And piggybacking on some of these comments, Daniel's in particular, and then Marjorie's, and then Molly Haskell's, God love her, fabulous. I feel like if this film were re-released today, the tagline on the one sheet might be something like, he managed to ruin the lives of not one, but 2 wonderful women merely because he couldn't amuse himself for a single Sunday afternoon. I mean, it's just so rich in the Me Too era. I guess I would ask, my question is, since it did not do well at the box office, and then she didn't direct for another 12 years, Gary, how did this movie, or Laurie, how did this, did it have a second life besides the International Film Festival, Women's Film Festival? How is this even on your radar? From then to now, where has it been?
Well, I think that, first of all, Ida Lupino did direct a lot of television over the next 10 or 12 years, but her company went out of business. She did not make any other feature films of this character. I think she directed a Disney picture in the mid-60s, The Trouble with Angels, which is definitely not in the realm of earlier stuff. I think that her films were sustained by writers and by perhaps being shown on television. And then around the mid-70s or the early 70s, when women filmmakers really started to be focused upon, at least in certain critical quarters, then her movies started to bubble up again. And then in the 90s, and with home video, the ubiquity of home video, and practically every movie under the sun getting a release of some sort, that's when that was a pivotal moment, I think, when those 3 films that I mentioned first came out on the Kino label in the best editions that they could at that time, taken from 16 and 35 millimeter print elements.
Got it.
Interestingly, this movie is actually in the public domain. I forgot where I saw that.
As are many of her films, unfortunately.
Because she was releasing them through.
She didn't have a good lawyer either in terms of preserving the copyright is another very important thing, which has led to many independent films getting into trouble with their elements and their presentations.
But I don't think people really thought of what was to come. I don't think they really got that. Yeah.
There's a documentary film, Abby, which came to mind. Some of our viewers may know it, called My Architect. It was actually released by Dan Talbot, who ran the Lincoln Plaza Cinema. His name often comes up here. And my architect ran at Film Forum, had a long run in 2003. And it's a documentary about a well-known New York City architect who led this very complex, incredible double life, 2 wives, 2 families, 2 parallel tracks, and in another one of the fact stranger than fiction documentaries. And I recommend it for now that we're in this mindset.
Great, thanks.
The other name that comes up in the credits that, like, when I watched it, I was like, why do I know the name Stanford Tischler? Like, I kept thinking it was because there's a builder named Tischler, I think, but it ends up he did like 130 mashes as both a writer and a director. So as did, I think, Ida do a few of them.
Well,
so.
I'm glad you mentioned that Subsidiary Credits. There are a couple of other names. Quickly, I want to throw out one is a story credit going to a writer who's called Larry Marcus in the credits. That's Lawrence B. Marcus, whom New Plaza fans know from our presentation of The Stuntman. He wrote the screenplay for that film. And also a film I think is one of the best movies of the 60s, Petulia by Richard Lester with George C. Scott and Julie Christie. Lawrence Marcus, and one other name, Robert Eggenweiler, who was a Robert Altman production and AD stalwart for many of Altman's pictures in the 60s and 70s and beyond.
Great. We have a couple more hands up, so I'm going to ask Lee to please start your video.
First of all, I'd like to say to Laurie, thank you so much for the time spent and lending your intelligence to this.
My pleasure.
It's really been very, very interesting. Second of all, my first question is, did Ida Lupino direct the TV show she did with Howard Duff?
No, Collier, no. Yeah, Collier did. I think
That's
Collier,
interesting.
Yeah.
Hollywood hasn't changed much, has it?
Yeah, no,
Laurie?
but in those days they hid it. In those days there weren't like they had hush money and everything was
Right.
sanitized before it went to the public. So
All right, Laurie, I'm going to take you back to the 5th grade because you said you came from New York. And one of the things we taught in the 5th grade was you read a story and then put your own ending on, another ending on it. So if you were to write another ending to this movie, how would you end it?
You're asking me that?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know. I think neither woman, if they have any self-respect, would take him back, but yet, he does have a child. And I think these 2 women, the only reason she becomes really good at business is because she can't have a child, and her business becomes her child. And
Right.
Ida is much, Ida's sort of the, like at this point in time, it would be like, oh, you got me pregnant, you got to leave your wife, we can go kill her, and in that respect, it's not your traditional noir, and it kind of leaves you thinking like, what do I think here? And in that way, again, there's a very strong new wave influence on her noir. And I think her female sensibility, because life isn't black and white, because it is all those shades of gray in between. And I think that comes across.
Thanks, Laurie. You passed my 5th grade class. Thank you very much.
Well, Lee, you might want to take a look at Ida's TV directing credits. She directed dozens of television shows, possibly her husband, Howard Duff, in a couple of them. And believe it or not, a few episodes of Gilligan's Island she directed as well.
Wow.
Directed a lot.
What a woman. What a woman.
She actually just got tired of it. How she came to directing is when she was supposed to do Not Wanted. The director fell ill, like I think the night before production or 2 nights, whatever. And she was like, hell, I can do it. I've done this before. And that kind of just started the ball rolling. And, the rest is history, as they say.
I wonder if a lot of women didn't start things that way by saying, I could do that.
I think.
Thanks. Thanks, guys.
She's a hero now to many independent filmmakers for that very reason.
Thank you, Lee. We have 2 more hands up, so I'm going to ask AR, I may be mispronouncing your name. Would you please start your video and unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you very much. AR, which is my initials.
Got it.
I wonder if you could point out some of the maybe tongue-in-cheek inside jokes that you might have noticed. Like I noticed a couple of things. Someone mentioned one I typed in there. It was Joan Fontaine who did say that that the gentleman, that Edwin Gwynn's character looks like Santa Claus. And that made me start thinking, was this made before Miracle on 34th Street or afterwards? It was made way after Miracle on 34th Street. So obviously that was an inside joke, for sure. And also when when Joan Fontaine walks into the bedroom, you see her carrying a tin soldier that it really looked like an Oscar to me. I wonder whether anyone else noticed things like that as well. Also, one other thing I noticed in the plot, I thought this was kind of silly though, that Harry Graham was noticed for his bigamy, this smart gentleman for being Harrison Graham. You know, it seems if you're trying to hide an identity, it wouldn't be such a shock to use such a similar name. So I wonder whether any of these other quirky little things were noticed by others.
Well, here's the thing that I think you have to keep in mind with some of those quirky things, and that is part of narrative visual storytelling, in that a lot of times it's a lot quicker to show someone the back of a letter opener than start going through all the history. Because let's face it, Harry is a shortened for Harrison. You know, when you pay bills, you pay by your formal name. You know, again, let's think 1950s. So, you know, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but it's again that point of visual storytelling where an inanimate object tells the story all in and of itself. With just that close up, so much exposition is told.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate the question. And our last question actually is going to go to Barry. Barry, if you would unmute yourself and start your video.
You got me?
Good to go.
Gotcha.
Okay, good. Gary, thank you again. And Laurie, thank you for your contributions.
Thank you.
Really, really great backstory. You may have answered part of my question that Lee raised. It goes without saying women have had an incredibly challenging hill to climb, breaking into the directorial routes in Hollywood. And it's a multi-part question. How Ida? Why not others? Especially, why weren't more women able, after Ida broke through, to break through it? Or who gave her the break? And why others didn't follow? Even in this era, it's still a challenge for women. This year is a breakthrough year with 3 being nominated for the Golden Globe Award, 3 women. But why Ida at that time, and why not others? And who gave her the break?
Well, Glenn Erickson, Barry, in that piece, that quote I read to you, his column is called Cine Savant. His theory is that Ida, because of she was a pretty successful actress in the 40s and did a lot of work at Warner Brothers and was a pretty tough cookie. Somehow was just able to will her way into raising the money and getting those pictures off the ground. But that was an exceptional, sort of like John Cassavetes. I think in some ways, being an actor and knowing a lot of actors, was able to get some of his pictures made. But others weren't so powerful or persuasive or fortunate, I think.
This was also the beginning of the independent filmmaker. You know, you have to realize there was something called the Consent Decree of 1948 that broke up the studios as a vertically integrated monopoly, which now opens cinema to both foreign and independent markets. But people had to be more hands-on. The banks weren't willing to bankroll the movies anymore because they didn't have a guarantee of exhibition. So you had to be, so like in this movie, they took over the distribution. That's why it's probably I think Gary said, in public domain because they don't have
Well,
any power, you know?
the consent decree that Laurie's referenced a couple of times now, very important, which led to the unraveling of ownership of thousands of theaters around the country. You know, MGM owned a block of theaters, Warner Brothers, et cetera, et cetera. But it took many years for that to sort of get unraveled. And I think in the early 50s, when Ida and Collier Young tried to release the Bigamists themselves, they probably still had a very hard time getting into quality theaters, and probably an even harder time getting paid. Because as I have experienced myself in the business, if you don't have a steady flow of product and they have only one picture, you have very little leverage to get paid from certain exhibitors, not all.
Yeah, this was actually part of a 5-picture deal that I think it's a 5-picture that only one got made. They wouldn't agree to bankroll the
Yeah, well,
other.
the cash flow obviously was not good.
Yeah.
Thank
But
you
it's
both.
a very highly regarded film, regardless.
Thanks, Barry. Appreciate it. And we
Thanks,
have one more
Barry.
hand that just came up. So we're going to ask Janice to please start your video and unmute yourself.
I am.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Welcome.
I had a wonderful time with this film. I saw it a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't remember certain parts that were in it. But one thing that struck me immediately was how extraordinary Lupino is as an actor. As a producer, a director, I think she's fantastic. But when I first saw this film, first saw her work many years ago, when I was but a small child, I wondered to myself then, why do they have this very plain lady acting the part of somebody who's supposed to be very attractive? When I looked at it the other day, I thought, who is this magnificent woman who looks absolutely wonderful, and I want to know her? The very difference of being somewhat adult makes a very big difference in the way one views a movie. The Edmund Gwenn character, my thoughts were, again, why is this very, very ordinary man, this Schlub, as one might call him, so attractive to these very intelligent women? I don't understand it. It makes no sense. Are they so desperate for company? What is the matter with these women? Are they just so lonely? And of course, he's very nice. He's a good person, but he's deadly boring. And I was wondering how he got cast into that rather glamorous situation, although you have basically answered that question before I asked it. He was a very successful actor. I seem to remember seeing him in many films, but never quite in the part of a lover. And I thought it was interesting that way.
I think he was a friend of Ida Lupino with Janice. He had been in a previous film of hers, The Hitchhiker, which is probably the closest thing to a box office hit of these indie productions. And they probably had worked at Warner Brothers and knew each other well. That would be one theory.
Oh, that was it. Well, obviously there was much more to him than came off in that part.
Well, I want to thank you. Now, this is the second time you have given us this kind of across the decades perspective of a film you saw. You did it with The Red Shoes a couple of months ago, and how how one's impressions of a film can change and deepen and enlighten over the decades, and it's beautiful to hear.
I think thank you, but I think it's very important that one sees these films when one is young, or any film when one is young enough to have an impression and a memory, and then, well, as with a book, I mean, I've read Anna Karenina 4 times, and each time it's a different book.
I'll bet.
So this is how I felt about this film. I thought I was so thrilled to see Ida again that way, and now I want to see all her films again because she's obviously magnificent. So I thank you, and I thank everybody for their marvelous comments.
Thank you, Janice. So great. So that's the last of our questions.
Well, Saul, thank you as usual for all your guidance here. Sorry about the trailer, folks, but you You can check it out on YouTube. It's about 45 seconds, but very telling in the whole presentation of the film at that time. And also, one of our readers corrected me. The documentary that I recommended called My Architect is actually about a gentleman with 3 parallel lives, not just 2. So an added recommendation. Now, we have a very special program coming up in a couple of weeks, which Sean kind of masterminded here. So I think she should be the one to give us the details.
Great. Laurie and Gary, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, okay. Hi. Couple of things. First of all, Laurie, thank you so much for being our guest, and it was nice to have a woman on stage with us. We appreciate that so much. And really great stuff, you guys. Appreciate it. And I think I might be the only woman in the world who kind of has a crush on Edmund O'Brien, but I guess I'll just have to live with that. But what we do have coming up on the 17th of March, which is our next lecture, we have Stephen Smith, who's a biographer, who's written a biography about Max Steiner. And for those of you who are really familiar with films, Max Steiner is kind of the father of the film score, the modern film score. And so fascinating life. I think he did over 300 film scores. I'm not exactly sure. And we'll learn about that on the 17th when Stephen Smith does the lecture on Max Steiner. And then in homage to Max Steiner, we're going to do a film that was one of his very good film scores. There are a lot of good film scores, but a movie that we think's worth checking out and that Gary has chosen called The Big Sleep, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. And it's an interesting movie. And if you haven't watched it in a while, I think you're really going to enjoy seeing it again. And everyone scratches their heads in this movie about what did really happen. And that's kind of part of the allure of the film. So that's great. So that's on March 21st. And then because Max wasn't able to last week, he's going to do the Ida Lupino lecture on the 24th of March. And so I think, you know, if you really like this film, I think you would like to join that. And that's on Wednesday, the 24th in the afternoon. So hopefully you can join us for one or all of those. And thanks so much for coming today. As always, we really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you.